So I'm going to cover this topic here, and then after this we'll take a break. We're going to talk about regulatory reviews and professional assessments. Really, I'm going to speak to this from an owner's perspective because everybody on the team can, I think, relate to the owner's perspective. The federal requirements, and Andreas mentioned some of these, but I'm going to go more in detail. There's federal requirements like EPA, where we have to have asbestos and lead testing. This is something you have to think about if you're an owner of a facility. OSHA requirements, fall protection and work conditions may make a rehabilitation project, for example, infeasible, or it may make it feasible if you get permission to go about it a certain way from that agency. American with Disabilities Act, you have to sometimes add ramps or elevators or stairs. In Texas, we have the state requirements like the Texas accessibility standards, which actually have a lot of overlap with ADA, which are our federal standards for handicap accessibility. However, they're actually more stringent in a lot of ways in where they're applied and where they're required. And again, those can make a project that you have in mind as an owner when you just want to restore a building that you just bought. It may make it infeasible when you find there's regulatory reviews require things change. The Architectural Board and the Professional Engineers Board in Texas may require an architect and or engineer. And then you have the Texas Historical Commission, which sometimes is relevant if you have a plaque like the barracks building here on the campus has the historical plaque. And for a commercial facility, if you have a historical structure, you would have a tax benefit by having that plaque. And that's their leverage, you could say, if you want to make a modification where you have to get their approval before you make that modification. And also you have things like the state fire marshal, which may require fire sprinklers. These are all things that you have to think about if you own a facility like this. The local requirements, city ordinances usually, are the ones that in Texas typically will cite the building code, and that's the authority that references the building codes. You also have other types of ordinances, historical preservation ordinances, for example, which may require that you meet with a local community and get some review and commentary and approval of the project that you want to undertake, if they've defined a historic business district. Another type of non-historical ordinance that might affect a historical structure is rooftop unit screening, which, masonry structures, as Dr. Stavridis mentioned, you've got parapets that are unreinforced. They're poor flexural members. They don't take tension very well. So, you don't want to just add masonry on top of an existing parapet that's unreinforced to raise the parapet height just to screen a rooftop unit, because you may have created a very unsafe condition on top of something that may have been unsafe to begin with in many ways. So landscaping ordinances, there are all those city ordinances that we have to deal with. So some of these reference building codes, which are typically on a 3-year cycle, except for ASCE 7, which is on a 5-year cycle. These are, for example, the IBC, the International Building Code. And that's the one that references the documents that Andreas mentioned. There's the International Existing Building Code as well, and the International Property Maintenance Code. And I mentioned these three because they're all related to historical structures in one way or another. If you have an existing building and all you're doing is a restoration project, you're not actually changing the occupancy, you're not actually doing an addition or doing a major remodel, all you're trying to do is preserve what's there, then really the only one that applies is the International Property Maintenance Code, which is a much lower bar. However, as I will get into, there are similar provisions for dangerous and unsafe structures in all of the three of these documents, the IBC, IEBC, and the IPMC. The International Existing Building Code is something that did not start in 2000, which was the first IBC. The IEBC came out later and was the work intended to address the gray area, specifically with historical structures and other similar structures where you're not dealing with a brand new structure, and it's very difficult to comply with the straightforward provisions for a new structure. As Andreas mentioned, when you're designing a new building, you have all the luxury of just changing the structural layout. If you want to make a column bigger, make it bigger. With existing buildings, you don't have that luxury. So it does a very good job, in my opinion, of trying to identify what is the type of project. Is it an addition? Is it an alteration? Is it a repair? Is it historical? And then for each of those categories, it addresses specifically what you need to do, not just with structural, but also with other life safety issues like fire safety, fire egress, also things like mechanical, electrical, plumbing. The role of a local building official is not to enforce federal law and not to enforce state law, although sometimes they will choose to do that because they're the one bureaucratic official who's most involved in the project. The building official has a tough job. Building official has the authority to render interpretations of the building code. However, a building code official cannot simply waive those requirements if they're specifically provided for. For example, if a provision is very specifically saying that you have to have 5 feet of clearance in front of an electrical panel, for example, the building official can't say, 1 foot of clearance is fine. Okay? And sometimes you'll find that a building official is put in a very tough situation because these are real buildings in real-world situations where sometimes it's not technically feasible to address a code violation. And so that's why we rely on the building codes official with the existing structures so heavily. The role of professionals, on the other hand, is defined not at all by the building code, but rather by state acts and by contracts. State acts, for example, in the Engineering Practice Act. I personally, as a professional engineer, have an obligation to each and every one of you to protect you as the public and protect your health, your safety, and your welfare. You can also have a higher standard for me as a professional if you were to enter an agreement with me and have me, for example, if I were to sign a contract that said I will identify any and all life safety issues. Well, first of all, I probably wouldn't sign that contract. But if someone did sign that contract as an engineer or architect, they have a significantly higher responsibility on that project. There are also some legal precedents that may apply, but typically all this rolled into one means that the professional's obligation is to generally meet or exceed the local standard of care, which is defined very loosely, but there's a lot of legal precedent for what that means. And it's actually at that time. Codes change, research comes in, disasters happen, and we learn things from them, and we change the way we practice. The way we build buildings today is very, very different than the way we used to build buildings 100 years ago and 200 years ago. In 2012, that's the latest round of I codes, and I'm referring to that because there's a whole slew of documents. They all begin with I. There's the International Building Code, IEC, the ones I mentioned. There's also the Plumbing Code and others, Fire Code. One of the things you'll find in common is a definition of the word dangerous. And this has actually changed from what it was in previous codes. If you were to go to the 2003 IEBC, for example, you would find a 5-point definition rather than a 2-point definition of dangerous. And it was actually much more specific about some things. For example, if you have a wall that was leaning and the center of that wall at the midpoint was beyond the center third of the wall at the base, then that was by definition, according to the 2003 version of the existing building code, it was by definition dangerous. So if you have a case where you have some masonry that's leaning like in a veneer, you actually might measure that, and I've done that myself in many instances, and that's not a hard thing to find, is a case where that occurs. And I think that's part of the reason why on a practical level it was changed in the building code, and it's no longer in the building code. However, the spirit of it is still there. If you look at the first definition here, I think everybody would agree. Something's dangerous if the building or structure has collapsed, if it's partially collapsed, or it's moved off its foundation, or lacks the necessary support of the ground. The second one is the one that everybody has to really think hard about. There exists a significant risk of collapse, detachment, or dislodgement of any portion, member, or part of the structure under service loads. So service loads are actually defined in the building code fairly well. The thing that's not defined in this is the word significant. What is a significant risk of collapse? That's not a very specific term. In statistics, there's a study of reliability in structural engineering, where you have two bell curves of statistical probability of the strength of something and the load of something. And you can come up with a reliability index. And with all of new structures, we have our design factors, the load factors that Andreas mentioned. they give us a certain reliability for new structures, a generally consistent reliability for all new structures, regardless of material type. However, with historical masonry structures, that becomes very difficult. And who interprets this? The building code official. So the process in the codes is to address that is it says that any structure that's dangerous must be taken down and removed and made safe, period. So that's a big pill to swallow if you're an owner who just bought a historic building and you were very proud of it and you intended to spend a lot of money on restoring it, and then you got sticker shock and you realize it actually cost 10 times as much as you thought it was going to take to restore that building, and now the building official, because you had an engineer look at it, he's saying, now you've got to tear it down. All right? So that's why we're covering this, because this is probably one of the most important things for people to hear if they've never done a historic project before, is that this is a real situation that can happen very quickly. This also identifies a very clear process requiring the building official notify the owner of unsafe conditions. In ASCE 11, there's a document that tries to help, because we have a very tough situation where everybody wants to know, is it safe or is it unsafe? And there's not a real clear line. So this gives you good guidance on how to deal with existing buildings. It's an ANSI accredited standard, much like ASCE 7 and the other documents that Andreas mentioned. It's not mandatory unless, for example, if you make it so by part of your contract. If an architect says that I will do an assessment according to ASCE 11, well, then that architect has just obligated him or herself to meet all of the provisions. It's a good document, but I use it myself as a guideline, and I recommend that in practice. It defines this process to identify and resolve issues. It's got a good report format. The process is essentially recognizing that you're going to have an initial site visit. It's got a flow chart. And in that initial site visit, I'm not going to know anything about this facility the first time I walk onto it. And I may see things that strike me as very dangerous. Okay? It's actually very hard for me just by looking at something to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that something is dangerous without some study, though. Okay? So it then says the next step in the process is you have an agreement based on that initial site visit, and then you have a preliminary assessment. And from that preliminary assessment, I may say, I don't believe any further assessment is necessary. I believe we all have a handle what's going on, what you intend to do. The scope has been defined in the agreement based on the initial site visit. And then if there's something I think is necessary to do a more detailed assessment, then there's a third step in the process, which would be specific. For example, if there's a fire and I think that you need to have a study done of the capacity of a steel element, a cast iron element in historical masonry structure, to see if it's the effect of the fire has had on it. You might have a metallurgical study done that wasn't part of the preliminary assessment because we didn't think it was necessary when we did our initial site visit. So the report format mentions things that you may not think of. For example, to document the process you went through to collect all available documents. Sometimes a very cursory assessment is done and nobody really dug through available plan rooms to find documents. Sometimes people simply walk and they use photography to do an assessment. You need to document that that's the method you went through. There are a lot of ways you can assess masonry. As a matter of fact, there are material-specific guidelines and tables for figuring problems out, deductive reasoning, as well as identifying tests, all in this guide. For example, for wood, there's a whole section. For masonry, there's a whole section. And in these tables, it identifies the different material, but it also identifies a test, the pros, the cons. Is it an expensive test, or is it easy to do? Is it destructive, or is it non-destructive? Is the information it's going to tell you very valuable? What is the information it's going to tell you? And so it's a very good guide for it's a good checklist for every project for you to say, no, I don't think that's necessary, I don't think that's necessary, but I do think this one is. There are other standards out there. There's an ASTM that was developed. It's E2270. And this is the practice for periodic inspection of building facades for unsafe conditions. Some of you who are professionals in the audience may be familiar with some very well-known catastrophic problems with facades on the East Coast. For example, in New York, there were buildings where you have nets over your head as you walk on the street now because there are bricks that fall down. And that's due to poor construction practices. You also have much taller structures than you do here in Brownsville, for example. But the ordinances in the city of in those cities now require that you, for example, annually might have to have an ASTM E2270 inspection done. The minimum number of visual probes per facade is on that document. And let's say you've got a typical building with 4 sides. Well, each side is considered a facade. And these probes are visual probes. And you'll see in the pictures that Al and Mike will show you later that what we mean is that means removing a brick or removing a piece of terracotta or cast stone and then looking inside the facade backing system to see if the anchors are corroded, to see if it has anchors. And then you'll still, if you use this document, if you look it up, it's not a great guide on how to do it. It's a procedure, a test procedure on what to do. So you still relies on the judgment and the experience of the inspector when they open that hole, what they see. And the reason is because there's a wide variety of things that might come up. And so ASTM is not well suited to address that. The Masonry Society, on the other hand, has a group of professionals who are dedicated to the knowledge of and promoting the knowledge of masonry. And so they've developed a guide. It's a standard that is a guide for condition assessment of masonry facades. And this document is really suited for that inspector when he's doing that ASTM as part of a process with the ASCE 11 document, okay, to meet that question of is it unsafe or safe. And it addresses numerous types of historical masonry in great detail and has great checklists. So with that, we're going to take a break. It's 10 o'clock, and we'll take a 15-minute break, start around 10:15 with our next session. Are there any questions? Okay, good.